The Galactic Academy of Advanced Sciences stood like a crystal monument against the purple sky of Zirian Prime. Students from across the galaxy walked through its halls, their different forms creating a rainbow of species. The Academy prided itself on bringing together the brightest minds from every corner of known space. In classroom 7 Delta, Professor Vexter clicked his mandibles as he watched the daily drama unfold. The Korathian students had surrounded young Zixel again. The small Tenthari boy's blue skin had turned pale with fear as the larger aliens towered over him. "Give us your research notes, little squid," growled Rakdos, the biggest of the Korathian bullies. His red scales gleamed under the artificial lights and his claws scraped against the metal desk. "You know the drill." Zixel's tentacles trembled as he clutched his data pad closer to his chest. "Please, I need them for the quantum physics exam tomorrow. I worked all night on these calculations." The other Korathians laughed, their harsh voices echoing in the classroom. Mordek, Raktos' second-in-command, reached out with his massive arm and snatched the data pad away. "Not anymore, you don't." Professor Vexter continued organizing his teaching materials, pretending not to notice. This happened every day, and he had learned to look the other way. The Korathian Empire was one of the Academy's biggest financial supporters. Their students could do whatever they wanted, and the teachers knew better than to interfere. Other students in the classroom watched nervously. A few Xylonian bird people whispered among themselves, their feathers ruffling with anxiety. Some Aquarian water dwellers in their environmental suits bubbled quietly in distress, but none of them dared to help. The Korathians were too powerful, too dangerous. "You know what I think, little squid?" Rakdos leaned closer to Zixel, his breath hot and smelling of sulfur. "I think you're too stupid to be in this advanced class. Maybe you should go back to the basic levels with the other inferior species." Tears formed in Zixel's large eyes. He had worked harder than anyone to get into this class. His species, the Tenthari, were known for their intelligence, but they were also peaceful and physically weak. They made easy targets. Mordek started deleting files from the data pad, grinning as each hour of work disappeared forever. "Oops," he said with fake concern. "My claw slipped." The door to the classroom slid open with a soft hiss. Everyone turned to look, expecting another teacher or perhaps a late student. Instead, a figure none of them had seen before stepped inside. She was human, though most of the students had only heard stories about humans. They were supposedly one of the newer species to join the galactic community, coming from a small blue planet called Earth. This human was young, maybe in her early 20s by their standards. She had long brown hair tied back in a simple ponytail and wore the standard academy uniform. But there was something about her that made the entire room fall silent. She moved with a quiet confidence that seemed unusual for such a small, seemingly fragile species. Her dark eyes swept across the classroom, taking in the scene before her. Professor Vexter looked up from his desk, surprised. "Ah, you must be our new transfer student. I am Professor Vexter. You are." "Sarah Chen," she replied calmly. Her voice was soft but clear, carrying easily across the room. "I was told to report to advanced quantum physics." "Of course, please take any available seat." The professor gestured vaguely toward the back of the room, where several empty desks waited. Sarah nodded and began walking toward the back. She had to pass by the group of Korathians who were still tormenting Zixel. As she approached, Rakdos stepped slightly into her path, a sneer on his reptilian face. "Watch where you're going, Pinkskin," he growled, using the derogatory term some species used for humans. Sarah stopped walking. She turned her head slowly to look at Rakdos, then her gaze moved to Mordek, who was still holding Zixel's data pad. Finally, her eyes settled on the trembling Tenthari boy. The classroom grew impossibly quiet. Even Professor Vexter had stopped shuffling his papers. Sarah's expression didn't change. She didn't raise her voice or make any threatening gestures. She simply looked at Rakdos with those dark human eyes, and something in that gaze made the large Korathian take an involuntary step backward. "Give him back his data pad," Sarah said quietly. The words hung in the air like a challenge none of them had expected. Rakdos blinked his yellow eyes, confusion spreading across his scaled features. No one had ever challenged him before, especially not someone so small and apparently defenseless. He was twice Sarah's size, with claws that could tear through metal and strength that could crush bones. "Excuse me," he said, his voice dripping with disbelief. Did you just give me an order, human? Sarah didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her hands relaxed at her sides, her breathing calm and steady. But something about her presence filled the room like electricity before a storm. Every instinct that millions of years of evolution had given the various species in that classroom was suddenly screaming that they were in the presence of a predator. I asked you to give him back his data pad, Sarah repeated, her tone unchanged. It belongs to him. Mordek laughed, a harsh sound like grinding rocks. You think you can tell us what to do? Do you have any idea who we are? My father commands 3 star systems. Raktos' family owns mining operations across the galaxy. You're nothing but a primitive species that barely figured out faster-than-light travel. That may be true, Sarah acknowledged with a slight nod. But right now, in this classroom, you're just a bully picking on someone smaller than you, and where I come from, we don't tolerate bullies. The room seemed to grow colder. Professor Vexter shifted nervously at his desk, unsure whether to intervene. He had heard rumors about humans, stories that seemed too impossible to believe. Tales of a species that had turned their own homeworld into a paradise by first making it a hell. A people who had survived ice ages, plagues, wars, and disasters that would have destroyed any other civilization. Raktos drew himself up to his full height, trying to intimidate the human girl. You have no idea what you're dealing with, pink skin. I could break you in half without even trying. For the first time since entering the classroom, Sarah's expression changed. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth, but it wasn't friendly. It was the smile of someone who had heard that threat before and found it amusing. You could try, she said simply. Something in those 3 words made Raktos pause. There was no fear in her voice, no uncertainty. Just a calm statement of fact that suggested she had considered the possibility and wasn't particularly worried about it. Zixel watched from his desk, amazed. No one had ever stood up for him before. His tentacles had stopped trembling, and he found himself leaning forward, fascinated by this strange human who seemed completely unafraid. This is ridiculous, Mordek snarled. He stepped forward, still holding the data pad. I'll deal with this primitive myself. As he moved towards Sarah, something extraordinary happened. The human girl didn't back down or prepare to fight. Instead, she simply looked at him, really looked at him. And in that moment, Mordek saw something that made his blood run cold. He saw Earth, not the peaceful blue-green planet that appeared in official galactic databases. He saw the real Earth, the world that had forged humanity in fire and blood and endless struggle. He saw the predators that had hunted early humans through dark forests, the ice that had nearly destroyed their species, the wars that had raged across continents for thousands of years. He saw a species that had started as prey and turned itself into the apex predator of an entire planet. A people who had looked at the hostile universe and decided to make it their home anyway. A race that didn't just survive disasters, they thrived because of them. And he realized that this small, quiet girl standing in front of him was the product of millions of years of that evolution. She wasn't afraid because her ancestors had faced far worse than him and lived to tell about it. Mordek's legs began to shake. The data pad slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers and clattered to the floor. Pick it up, Sarah said softly, and give it back to him. Without thinking, Mordek bent down and retrieved the data pad. His movements were mechanical, driven by instincts he didn't understand. Every part of his brain was screaming at him to get away from this predator, to submit, to survive. He walked over to Zixel's desk and placed the data pad gently in front of the young Tenthari. I'm sorry, he whispered, the words coming out without his permission. Raktos stared at his second-in-command in shock. Mordek, what are you doing? She's just a human. But when he turned back to look at Sarah, he felt the same overwhelming presence that had affected his friend. It wasn't supernatural or mystical. It was simply the weight of evolutionary pressure, the accumulated strength of a species that had earned its place in the galaxy through struggle and determination. Sarah walked past the stunned Korathians and took a seat in the back of the classroom. She pulled out her own data pad and began reviewing her notes, acting as if nothing unusual had happened. Professor Vexter cleared his throat nervously. Well, let us begin today's lesson on quantum entanglement theory. But no one was paying attention to the lesson. Every eye in the classroom was on the quiet human girl who had just accomplished something that seemed impossible. Word spread quickly through the academy. By the next morning, every student knew about the human who had faced down the Korathian bullies without lifting a finger. The story grew with each telling, but the core facts remained the same. A small human girl had made the most feared students in the school back down with nothing but a look. Sarah arrived at her second class to find the hallways unusually quiet. Students stepped aside as she passed, not out of fear but out of curious respect. She noticed groups of smaller species, Tenthari, Xylonians, Aquarians, watching her with something that looked like hope in their eyes. In advanced stellar engineering, Professor Claveth tried to maintain order as whispers followed Sarah to her seat. The elderly Cathurian had been teaching for over 2 centuries and had seen every kind of student, but humans were still new to him. "Today we will be working in groups," Professor Claveth announced, his 4 arms gesturing at the holographic star charts floating around the room. "You must design a sustainable energy system for a colony ship traveling between galaxies. Choose your partners wisely." The usual pattern began immediately. The stronger, more politically connected species formed groups first. Korathians teamed up with other Korathians. The wealthy Valdorian merchant families stuck together. The academic elite from Proxima Beta gathered in their exclusive circle. Left behind were the usual outcasts. The gentle Tenthari, the peaceful Aquarians, the artistic Xylonians, and various other species considered weak or worthless by the galactic power structure. Zixel sat alone at his desk, trying not to look hopeful. Yesterday's events had been like a dream, but he didn't expect them to change anything long-term. The social order of the academy was too established, too rigid. Then Sarah Chen stood up and walked over to his desk. "Want to be partners?" she asked simply. Zixel's tentacles quivered with surprise. You want to work with me, but I'm just a Tenthari. You could join any group you wanted after yesterday." "I want to work with the best mind in the class," Sarah replied, sitting down beside him. "From what I've seen of your calculations, that's you." Before Zixel could respond, a soft voice spoke up behind them. Could we join your group too?" A young Xylonian named Pipra approached nervously, her blue feathers rustling. Behind her stood 3 other students, another Tenthari named Velter, an Aquarian called Bubbles whose water suit gurgled softly, and surprisingly a Korathian. But this Korathian was different. She was smaller than the others, with darker scales and nervous eyes. Sarah recognized her as one of the students who usually sat in the back, trying to avoid attention. "I'm Kexara," the Korathian girl said quietly. "I know my species has a reputation, but I'm not like them. I came to the academy to study, not to intimidate people." Sarah smiled, a real smile this time, warm and welcoming. "Everyone's welcome. What are your specialties?" As the group began introducing themselves, something extraordinary happened. Other students started to pay attention. Not to mock or interfere, but to watch in fascination as species that normally never interacted began working together. Zixel excelled at quantum mathematics and energy theory. Pipra had an artist's eye for elegant design solutions. Velter was a genius with computer systems and navigation. Bubbles understood fluid dynamics better than anyone else in the class. Kexara, despite her species' reputation, was brilliant at structural engineering. And Sarah had something none of the textbooks taught: the human ability to see connections, to find solutions that others missed, and to lead without dominating. "The problem with most colony ship designs," she explained as they worked, "is that they're built by committee. Every species adds their own requirements without considering how they all fit together. But what if we designed it from the perspective of the journey itself?" She began sketching on her data pad, and the others leaned in to watch. "Instead of thinking about human needs, or Tenthari needs, or Xylonian needs, what if we thought about what any living being would need during a 1,000-year journey between galaxies?" The ideas began flowing. Zixel calculated energy requirements for a hybrid biological-technological system. Pipra designed living spaces that could adapt to different species' needs. Velter created navigation systems that learned from the crew's behavior patterns. Bubbles solved the water recycling challenges that had stumped engineers for decades. Kexara built the framework that could hold it all together. At other tables, the traditional power groups were struggling. The Korathian team was arguing over who got to be in charge. The Proxima Beta elite couldn't agree on basic design principles because each student wanted to showcase their individual genius. The Valdorians kept changing their design based on cost-benefit analyses that ignored practical reality. Professor Claveth found himself drawn to Sarah's table again and again. The energy there was unlike anything he'd seen in his 2 centuries of teaching. Students who had never spoken to each other were building on each other's ideas, creating something greater than any of them could have achieved alone. "How did you know?" Kixera asked Sarah during a break. "How did you know I wasn't like the others?" Sarah looked up from their design calculations. "You were the only Korathian who looked upset when they were bullying Zixel yesterday. That told me everything I needed to know about who you really are." As the class period ended, their group had created something remarkable. A colony ship design that was more efficient, more elegant, and more sustainable than anything the Academy had seen before. Professor Claveth examined their work with growing amazement. "This is extraordinary. I've never seen students collaborate like this. How did you manage to integrate so many different approaches?" Sarah glanced around at her teammates, all of them glowing with pride and accomplishment. "We just remembered that we're all on the same journey." But their success hadn't gone unnoticed by everyone. As they packed up their materials, Hractos and his followers watched from across the room, their expressions dark with resentment. The natural order was being disrupted, and they didn't like it one bit. The change started small but grew quickly. Sarah's group project had been so impressive that Professor Claveth displayed it as an example for other classes. Soon, students across the academy were talking about the impossible collaboration between species that had never worked together before. More importantly, the outcasts began finding their voices. In the academy's central plaza, where students gathered between classes, a new pattern emerged. Instead of the usual segregated clusters based on species and power, mixed groups began forming. Tenthari students shared mathematical insights with Aquarians. Zalonians collaborated with peaceful Korathians on art projects that bridged cultural gaps. Sarah often found herself at the center of these gatherings, not as a leader giving orders, but as a catalyst helping others discover their own strength. She had a gift for asking the right questions, for making connections that others missed. "The thing about humans," explained Zixel to a group of younger students, "is that they see potential where others see problems. Sarah looked at our class and didn't see outcasts and misfits. She saw engineers and artists and scientists who just needed a chance to show what they could do." But not everyone was happy with these changes. Hractos paced angrily in his private dormitory, surrounded by his followers and several other students from powerful species. The Valdorian merchant Prince Luxaro leaned against the window, his golden skin reflecting his displeasure. "This has gone far enough," Luxaro declared. "The natural order exists for a reason. Some species are meant to lead, others to follow. This human is disrupting everything our families have built." Mordek, still shaken from his encounter with Sarah, shifted nervously. "Maybe we should just leave it alone. She hasn't actually hurt anyone. If anything, the academy is more peaceful now." Hractos turned on him with a snarl. "Peaceful? The weak species are getting ideas above their station. Yesterday I saw a Tenthari arguing with a professor about theoretical physics. A Xylonian questioned one of my father's business practices in economics class. They're forgetting their place." "And it's all because of her," added Zurich, a student from the militaristic Thrakari Empire. His cybernetic implants glowed red as he spoke. "Remove the human and everything goes back to normal." Professor Vexter passed by in the hallway outside, pretending not to overhear. He had been watching the changes in the academy with growing concern, not because he disagreed with them, but because he knew the consequences would be severe. The Academy's board of directors consisted of representatives from the galaxy's most powerful civilizations. The Korathian Empire, the Valdorian Trade Federation, the Thrakari Military Commonwealth. They all expected their children to graduate with the same advantages they'd always had. If the social order truly changed, funding would disappear, influential professors would be reassigned, and the academy itself might close. But Professor Vexter had also seen something in the past weeks that he'd thought impossible. Students learning for the joy of discovery rather than for political advantage. Young beings working together instead of competing for dominance. The academy was becoming what it was supposed to be, a place of learning and growth for all species. The crisis came during the academy's most important event, the annual innovation competition. Each year, student teams presented their solutions to real galactic problems, judged by a panel of the most respected scientists, engineers, and leaders in known space. Winners received full scholarships, guaranteed positions in prestigious research institutions, and most importantly, the political connections that shaped the galaxy's future. Traditionally, the competition was dominated by teams from powerful species with access to advanced resources and family connections. The Korathian Empire typically won the military technology category. Valdorian merchant families excelled at economic solutions. Proxima Beta's academic elite conquered the pure science divisions. This year was different. Sarah's expanded group, now calling themselves the Synthesis Collective, had grown to include over 40 students from 17 different species. They had divided into multiple teams, each tackling different aspects of the same fundamental problem: how to create truly sustainable colonies that could thrive for millennia without depleting their resources. Their approaches were radical. Instead of trying to dominate new worlds, they designed systems that worked with existing ecosystems. Rather than building rigid structures, they created adaptable technologies that evolved with changing needs. Where traditional solutions relied on hierarchy and control, the Synthesis Collective emphasized cooperation and balance. The results were extraordinary. Their terraforming proposal would reduce environmental damage by 90% while increasing productivity. Their social organization model eliminated the class conflicts that had plagued colonies for centuries. Their resource management system was so efficient that it could support 10 times the population of traditional designs. But more than their innovations, what impressed the judges was how the teams worked together. Students who should have been bitter rivals were freely sharing ideas, building on each other's concepts, and celebrating collective success over individual achievement. Dean Vorthak, the Academy's highest administrator, watched the presentations with growing alarm. As representative of the hegemonic council, he understood the political implications of what he was seeing. If these collaboration models spread beyond the Academy, they could undermine the power structures that held the galaxy together. During the lunch break, he called an emergency meeting with the most influential students. "This has gone too far," he announced to the gathered representatives of major civilizations. "The human and her followers are promoting dangerous ideas. Equality between species, resource sharing, cooperative governance. These concepts threaten everything our societies have built." Hractos nodded eagerly. "We've been saying the same thing, Dean Vorthak. Give us permission to handle this problem and we'll restore proper order." "No violence," the Dean commanded firmly. "The Academy cannot afford that kind of scandal, but there are other ways to address this situation." He activated a holographic display showing academic records, family connections, and political affiliations. "The human has no powerful allies, no political protection. Her visa status depends entirely on her academic performance. If she were to be found guilty of academic misconduct, she'd be expelled and banned from the Academy," Luxaro finished with a cold smile. "Interesting, and I suppose if evidence of such misconduct were to be discovered." "That would be most unfortunate," Dean Vorthak agreed, "but necessary for maintaining standards." What they didn't realize was that their conversation was being recorded by Velter's monitoring systems, which he had installed to help protect the Synthesis Collective from exactly this kind of political maneuvering. Within minutes, Sarah and her friends knew exactly what they were facing. But instead of being afraid, Sarah smiled that same calm smile she had worn when facing down the bullies on her first day. "Let them try," she said quietly. "We have something they don't understand, the truth." The trap was sprung during the final presentations of the innovation competition. As Sarah's team prepared to present their unified colony system, Dean Vorthak stood before the packed auditorium with a grave expression. "I regret to inform you that we have discovered evidence of serious academic misconduct," he announced. "It appears that several students have been sharing restricted research materials and collaborating in ways that violate Academy honor codes." He held up a data crystal that supposedly contained proof of illegal collaboration between Sarah's group and outside research institutions. "This evidence was brought to our attention by concerned students who noticed suspicious behavior." Sarah stood calmly as security officers approached her row. She had expected this move, but seeing it happen still felt surreal. Around her, her teammates looked shocked and angry. "This is ridiculous," Zixel protested, his tentacles writhing with emotion. "Sarah has never cheated on anything." "The evidence speaks for itself," Dean Vorthak replied coldly. "Miss Chen, you are hereby suspended pending a full investigation. Security will escort you from the premises immediately." But as the officers reached for Sarah, something unexpected happened. Professor Clavith stood up from the faculty section. "Dean Vorthak, I must object," the elderly Cathurian said firmly. "I have personally observed Miss Chen's work throughout the semester. Every calculation, every design element, every innovation has been developed openly in my classroom. If there has been collaboration with outside sources, I would have witnessed it." "Professor, you are out of order," the dean snapped. "No," came another voice. Professor Vexter had also risen. "I believe you are the one who is out of order, Dean Vorthak. I too have monitored Miss Chen's work closely. The accusations you're making are false." More professors began standing. Then something extraordinary happened. Students began rising too. First Zixel, then Pipra, then Kexara. Within moments, 3/4 of the auditorium was on its feet. But Sarah herself remained seated, a small smile playing at her lips. She pulled out her own data pad and connected it to the presentation system. "Before you arrest me," she said calmly, "I'd like to show everyone something." The main screen flickered to life, displaying Velter's recording of the dean's conversation with the student conspirators. Every word was crystal clear, every detail of their plan to frame Sarah exposed for all to see. The auditorium erupted. Students shouted in outrage, professors demanded explanations, and Dean Vorthak's face went pale as he realized his career was over. But Sarah wasn't finished. She stood slowly and walked to the center of the stage. "This recording proves what many of us already knew," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chaos. "There are those who believe that power comes from keeping others down, from maintaining artificial barriers between species, from ensuring that only the right kind of people succeed." She gestured toward her teammates, toward all the students who had found their voices over the past months. "But we've proven something different. We've shown that when you give everyone a chance to contribute, when you judge ideas instead of ancestry, when you build bridges instead of walls, amazing things happen." The presentation screen behind her lit up with their collective work. Colony designs that surpassed anything in Academy history, scientific breakthroughs that solved problems others thought impossible, art that bridged cultural divides, and social innovations that promised a better future for all species. "The galaxy doesn't need more rulers," Sarah continued. "It needs more teachers, more builders, more dreamers. It needs people who look at differences and see opportunities for collaboration instead of excuses for domination." Judge Calareth, the most respected scientist on the competition panel, stood slowly. The ancient Etherian had been silent throughout the drama, but now her crystalline form pulsed with light. "In my 3,000 years of life," she said in her melodic voice, "I have rarely witnessed such a profound demonstration of what education should achieve. Not just the transfer of knowledge, but the transformation of perspective." She turned to address the entire auditorium. "The Synthesis Collective has already won this competition, not just with their innovations, but with their proof that cooperation transcends the limitations of any single species or culture." The other judges nodded in agreement. The military representative from the Thrakari Empire looked uncomfortable, but even he couldn't deny the superiority of what they had witnessed. Dean Vorthak tried one last desperate move. "These collaborations violate our fundamental principles. The Academy has always maintained proper hierarchies between species." "Then perhaps," Judge Calareth replied serenely, "it is time to change those principles." 3 months later, Sarah stood once again in Classroom 7 Delta, but everything was different. The Academy had new leadership, new policies, and most importantly, a new spirit. Students from all species worked together freely, teachers encouraged innovation over conformity, and the artificial barriers that had divided the galaxy's brightest minds were crumbling. Rakdos sat in the back corner, struggling with advanced mathematics while Zixel patiently tutored him. The former bully had discovered that intelligence and bullying couldn't coexist. Once he stopped wasting energy on intimidation, he found reserves of curiosity he'd never known he possessed. Dean Vorthak had been quietly reassigned to a minor administrative position on a distant outpost. The student conspirators faced academic probation, but were given chances to earn redemption through community service and collaborative projects. Professor Vexter had become the new dean, and his first act was to establish the Chen Protocols, a set of guidelines ensuring that all species received equal opportunity and support at the academy. The thing about humans, Zixel explained to a group of new students, isn't that they're stronger or smarter than everyone else. It's that they see potential in places others don't look. Sarah overheard him and smiled. She had learned something too during her time at the academy. Every species had their own unique gifts, their own perspectives to contribute. Humans weren't special because they were superior. They were valuable because they had learned, through necessity and survival, to find strength in diversity rather than uniformity. The galaxy was changing, one classroom at a time, one collaboration at a time, one breakthrough at a time. And it was changing because a small human girl had walked into a room full of bullies and shown them something better than fear. She had shown them hope. Years later, when historians studied the period known as the Galactic Renaissance, they would trace its origins to a single moment in a classroom on Zirian Prime. The moment when someone finally stood up to the bullies and said, "There's a better way." And the galaxy listened.